Hello again, BookTube. I thought I'd come to you with yet another video with some more non-fiction recommendations for the glorious event that is Non-Fiction November. I thought I would just give you some more titles to chew on and to mull over as we celebrate this month of reading non-fiction books. Again, it's going to be largely history. I have maybe one or two books which aren't history related, but most of the books, in keeping with what most of my non-fiction reading, will be history books. All of them are books which I have read at some point or another. Some of them I've not read in many years, since I was a teenager. So forgive me if I can't give you an exhaustive amount of information about them. Later today, I am actually going to the concert. I am going to see a performance of Tchaikovsky's Sixth Symphony, performed by the conductor Karina Kanellakis, and I'm rather looking forward to it. It's going to take place in the Royal Festival Hall, which is all the way down in the southern part of central London, which is roughly an hour from where I live. And as I've said before, Tchaikovsky's Sixth Symphony is not my favourite of his symphonies. I much prefer his Fifth Symphony. I can understand why his Sixth is more popular. I can understand why it's more highly rated by musicologists. I can understand from a technical point of view the fact that it's more sophisticated, that it's more complex in the way it's put together and the way in which it's work and all of the various intricate bits and bobs that go into making a symphony. But for me, it will always probably take second place for me to his Fifth Symphony. And largely on the strength of the last movement of the Fifth Symphony. This triumphant major key. Da 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 da. It just lifts my soul every time I hear it. So that is my main reason for preferring that symphony to the Sixth Symphony. But I still like the Sixth Symphony. I've never heard it performed live. I heard this same conductor conduct the Fifth Symphony live. I believe it's the London Symphony Orchestra that I'm going to hear, or is it the London Philharmonic? One of those two. I can never get the exact names right, because all of these different orchestras, to a certain point, all bleed into one another. But anyhow, let's get started with the books that I would like us to discuss in this video. First up, we have Bounded Choice by Janja Lalich. Janja Lalich is an American academic, and she is a scholar who has spent her life studying cults. She was actually a member of a cult when she was much younger, many decades ago, called the Democratic Workers' Party, which was a political organization that blended Marxism with feminism. And she recounts in this book her own experiences being part of that rather nefarious organization. Now, as someone who was, some years ago, a member of a cult, and who only recently managed to extricate myself from that organization, I've gone down a real rabbit hole these past few years in reading about cults and reading about the ways in which they control their members, the ways in which people recover after leaving, the fallout from leaving, the various psychological, social, economic aspects to being a part of and ultimately breaking from a cult. And it's something which, if you haven't experienced it yourself, the reaction that you'll often have to a lot of these stories is one of incredulity, and even a quiet condescension, this belief that I would never join a cult, I would never be deceived in such a way. And one of the important things about books like these is that they are humbling experiences, because they remind us that we all really have these propensities towards cults. All of us are vulnerable in some way. All of us will have moments in our lives when the siren song, or the siren call of a cult, is stronger than it otherwise would be. And Janja Lalich does a great job in her book of talking about the things that draw people to cults, as well as the actual experience of being in a cult. The title, Bounded Choice, is based on a concept that Lalich has come up with to describe what it feels like to have your agency taken from you when you're in a cult. This idea of bounded choice is basically that when you're in a cult, you have the illusion of choice, you have the illusion of agency, but in actual fact, your choices are very much narrowed down to what the cult wants you to do, or wants you to believe. In theory, you can go against the cult, but there are consequences for doing so. Shunning, expulsion, the disapproval of your fellow cult members, shaming, humiliation, the loss of your friendship circle, the loss of your romantic relationships, which may well be bound up with the cult. These are all things to consider when we are talking about this whole business of cults. So Janja Lalich's book is superb at discussing this very pressing psychological problem that all members of cults will face if they are in one of these various organizations. And I couldn't recommend it strongly enough, especially if you have actually been a member of a cult. So that's Janja Lalich's Bounded Choice. Next we come to a similar book, although this is more political in its focus. This is by a woman called Aileen Kraditor, who actually passed away a few years ago. It's called The Mental World of the American Rank-and-File Communist, 1930 to 1958. And she deals with the psychological experiences of people who were actually members of the American Communist Party during the years that are on the cover of the book, years during which she was actually a member herself, only to later see the error of her ways and break decisively with communist ideology. It's very similar in some ways to what Janja Lalich talks about in her book, although it's dealing more specifically with American communism and what it was like to be part of this, effectively a fifth column party within the United States. And again, it's a strong recommend from me, especially if, like myself, you have been a member of a far-left organization. All of these far-left organizations run practically the same way, down to the fact that they have this concept of democratic centralism, which in practice is not very democratic at all. So that's The Mental World of the American Rank-and-File Communist, 1930 to 1958. I think Jimmy Higgins, which is the name you see here, was some sort of nickname that was given to you if you were a member of the Communist Party. I don't remember the exact, the full context of that nickname, but that is part of the title that you can see there. This is a very old book. It's not in print anymore. It definitely isn't in print anymore. I was lucky to get this. I paid good money for it online. This was published in 1988. I'm certain that this is no longer in print, so you'd be lucky if you get your hands on a copy of this. Maybe there might be a copy or two floating online somewhere. There's no guarantee, really. You may be lucky enough to find it in some second-hand bookstore, but I wouldn't count my luck in that regard. I'm actually very privileged to have this book. Next we have This book, Every Time a Friend Succeeds, Something Inside Me Dies. The Life of Gore Vidal by J. Perini. Now, I remember when Gore Vidal passed away. I was 12 or 13 at the time. This was, I think, the summer of 2012. And I remember getting ready for school that morning. I remember having my breakfast. And what I always did, as a precocious young teenager that I would watch the news before leaving the house. And I would invariably watch Al Jazeera, because I just loved its global focus, its global scope in terms of the stories it covered. And one of the top stories that they were covering that morning was in fact the passing of Gore Vidal, a man that I knew absolutely nothing about as a 13-year-old boy. All I knew from what they were saying on the news was that he was some famous American writer. I had no clue really who he was. I saw the famous footage of him with William F. Buckley, which was part of the obituary coverage of him that morning. And I remember being mildly entertained by it, but it didn't leave much of an impression on me. It was many years later that I actually took the trouble to read more about this extraordinary man and this extraordinary talent in the world of American letters. And if, like me, you are an avaricious consumer of YouTube, you will find there a wealth of Gore Vidal material. It's a lot like what you have with Christopher Hitchens, really. There is a veritable rabbit hole of Gore Vidal content. Interviews, lectures, public appearances on talk shows, like the Dick Cavett Show, where he famously went toe-to-toe with the rather stupid and obnoxious Norman Mailer, who actually physically assaulted him before they went on stage during that very famous event that I think was broadcast live. I don't quite remember, but Vidal was absolutely on fire during that television appearance. I still remember his famous stinging words. Once again, words fail Norman Mailer. What better riposte could you have towards a brute like Mailer, given how he behaved that evening? But this is a life of him, a biography of sorts, by a close friend of his, J. Perini, who is a well-known writer in his own right, and it takes the form of a part biography, part memoir of J. Perini's own experiences with Vidal over the course of his life. Vidal was an infuriating figure to get to know. He could be incredibly charming and charismatic and witty, but he also had a mean streak to him. And if you ended up on the wrong side of him, and you were unlucky enough to become an enemy of his, as happened to his ex-friend, Christopher Hitchens, he would let you have it with both barrels, and he would make it his goal to destroy you. So, because great legends when it comes to the world of American letters and American literature. I've actually read a few of the articles in his massive United States essay collection, which contains almost all of his essays over many, many decades. And I've also had the privilege of reading his fantastic historical novel about the life of Julian the Apostate. I haven't read the other novels that I have on my shelf. I hope to get to them one of these days. But this is my strong recommendation for a Life of Gore Vidal, the inimitable man of letters, Gore Vidal. Every time a friend succeeds, something inside me dies, which tells us a lot about Gore Vidal's mentality when it comes to the success of his rivals. But moving on, we have Peter the Great, His Life and World by Robert K. Massie. This is a book I first read when I was in sixth form, and I was actually studying Peter the Great, and I was studying early modern Russia for A-level history. And I remember really enjoying this biography. This is one of the finest biographies I've ever read of any individual, and I've read an awful lot of biographies, so I'd like to think that my word counts for something when I say that this is quite simply extraordinary, and I don't think there is a biography that beats it. It is written by a now deceased but fairly well-known biographer of Russian historical personages. He also wrote a couple of other works about Catherine the Great and also about Nicholas and Alexandra, which I haven't read. But if you want to know more about this greatest of Russian monarchs, this is the place where you should go. Robert K. Massie's capacious biography of Peter the Great in this very handsome hardback copy. I actually read this in paperback, believe it or not. I didn't actually realize I had this hardback copy until a few years ago. It's actually part of a series of books that were given to me by my school library because they were actually chucking out a bunch of their old books that no one wanted, and they gave me those books because they knew that I was a massive bibliophile and that I would really appreciate them. So that was how I came to have this in my possession. I've never actually read this in hardback. I read this in paperback when I first read it, and by that time I was in another school. So this was a very fortuitous rediscovery, if I may say so. Next we come to Napoleon the Great by Andrew Roberts, who is a master of popular biography. Like myself, he is very much a Bonapartist. I haven't read this in years, much like with the Robert K. Massie biography. So again, I can't give you as much detail as I might like. This is before I started underlining entire passages in my books, so I can't even point you towards any passages I enjoyed particularly, because I can't point to any physical evidence within this book, but I can say that this was a very, very engrossing read indeed. Roberts is a formidable writer. He writes the story of Napoleon as if it was a novel, and you will not be able to put this down once you begin reading it. So that's Napoleon the Great by Andrew Roberts, very much nailing his colours to the mast as to what he thinks of that most extraordinary of French historical figures. Next up we have Ali Millar's The Last Days. This is a book about a memoir, really, about the writer's experiences living as a Jehovah's Witness and being brought up in that rather nefarious cult. Let's be blunt about that. The Jehovah's Witnesses are a cult. Their practices are vile. Their treatment of their members is simply inexcusable. Their treatment of women is appalling and abhorrent. Their covering up of sexual abuse is quite simply scandalous. And Ali Millar does a fantastic job of exposing all of that in her absolutely scintillating memoir of her life as a Jehovah's Witness. Now, I think that this book is not only a searing indictment of the organization, it's also magnificently well written. The prose simply sings. Millar is an absolutely fantastic writer. This was not only a very interesting read from a purely technical point of view, because it gave me more information about how the organization operates and what its belief system is like, but it was also a really enjoyable reading experience. It was very much like reading a novel. And this is one of the works I would point anyone to if they want to know more about what it's like to be a member of a cult. So that's Ali Millar's The Last Days. Next we come to The Cult of Trump by Stephen Hassan. Stephen Hassan is actually someone who I know very well. I actually did an interview with him some years ago about my experiences being a member of a cult, and it's actually available on YouTube. But he is a well-known American cult expert and writer who recently wrote this book called The Cult of Trump, in which he goes into great detail exploring the ways in which Donald Trump is leveraging the same methods used by cult leaders to control his followers and to extort obedience and slavish worship and adoration from his supporters and minions. And Stephen Hassan knows what he's talking about, because not only is he an academic who has actually researched cults for many, many decades, but he actually personally experienced what it was like to be a member of a cult, because he was a member of the Moonies when he was a young man. And that experience was very harrowing for him, and it gave him a lifelong motivation to help other people escape cults in the way that he was able to escape a cult. So this is a book that is very timely because of what's happening in the United States right now, has been happening for the past decade or so in American politics, and it's not likely to win over people who are die-hard Trump supporters, but certainly for those people who are seeking more information on how Trump got a following in the first place, this is definitely the first place where you should begin your research into how to combat this virus, this mind virus that is Trumpism. So that is The Cult of Trump by Stephen Hassan. We next come to Becoming Hitler by Thomas Weber. This is a book I read a few years ago by an up-and-coming historian. Am I being condescending when I say that? Because if I remember correctly, he is fairly young. So this came out in 2017. And this is about the early life of Hitler. This is a revisionist account of how he became Hitler, how he became a Nazi. It combats a lot of the myths that Hitler spun about his own life. If you believe Hitler and take his words at face value, which you should not because he's Adolf Hitler, then you would come away thinking that he was always a die-hard Nazi, that he had his opinions fully formed, fully worked out from a very early age, and nothing could be further from the truth. In actual fact, Hitler, like many of his contemporaries in the immediate aftermath of World War I, was very much sorting out what he actually believed. And there's good reason to believe that in his early years, for a brief period of time, he actually had socialist sympathies. And he may well have been in attendance at the funeral of the Bavarian Marxist leader Kurt Eisner. There's actually a picture of someone that may be Corporal Hitler in attendance at Eisner's funeral. So that's just an extraordinary factoid for you. But I really enjoyed reading this. It really gave a lot more context to how Hitler became the man that we all now know and deeply loathe as an embodiment of evil. And next up, we have another book about a similar, about post-war, post-World War I, I should say, interwar Germany. This is about the German Revolution, and it's about how close Germany came to becoming communist. I don't actually agree with Gerwarth's thesis that Germany could have become communist. I think it's very unlikely that Germany would actually have succumbed to communism. But it's nevertheless really interesting, especially the bits that talk about what the communists did when they briefly seized power in Bavaria. And any illusions that you may have about German communism and how it would have been a kinder, gentler version of Bolshevism had the communists seized power there in a more advanced country that wasn't backward like Russia. Any illusions like that should be punctured when you read about what the German equivalent of the Bolsheviks did when they seized power. It's quite simply monstrous and had a devastating effect on the political trajectory of Germany. It led directly to the rise of Adolf Hitler and the Nazis. So really, far from celebrating the German Revolution, we should be much more nuanced in our judgments, because on the one hand, yes, it did bring about a short-lived liberal democracy. On the other hand, it also unleashed some very dark forces in German politics, which set Germany down a very bad path, from which it would take many, many years and another world war before it finally recovered. So that is Robert Gerwarth's November 1918 about the German Revolution. This is the first volume of Philip Dwyer's Napoleon, The Path to Power, 1769 to 1799. Dwyer, unlike Andrew Roberts, is not a partisan Bonapartist. He's a fairly balanced scholar of Napoleonic history. He doesn't really take sides on whether Napoleon is a hero or villain. I remember reading this about a year or so ago, or a year and a half ago, is it? Something like that. And really enjoying it, and thinking that it shed new light on Napoleon and on his early years, in particular the role that was played by his family and by his fellow Corsicans in helping him rise to power. And a lot of the stuff he writes about the Directory and about the way in which the constitution of the Directory worked, it felt very topical, especially when we were talking about American politics. For those of you who don't know, the French Directory was basically the last government that France had before Napoleon's seizure of power. And this government was so dysfunctional, and its constitution was so deadlocked between executive, legislature, and judiciary, that whenever there was a deadlock, which there frequently was, the executive would invariably coup their own government in order to clear the deadlock and actually get anything done. So really, for those people who see Napoleon as this villain who destroyed the promise of the French Revolution, the promise of the French Revolution was long dead by the time Napoleon seized power. France was never really, in any case, a democracy under the French revolutionary regime. But it certainly was not that by the time Napoleon launched his coup, which was welcomed by many French people as being a fitting end to the corrupt and inefficient regime of the Directory. So I think it's important to put that in context here. Napoleon wasn't destroying some perfect democratic system. He was stepping in place of the corrupt wreckage of the old order, the old discredited revolutionary order, and put in place something which, in my mind, is much superior to it. Was much superior, I should say. So this is Napoleon, The Path to Power. I haven't read the other two volumes in his Napoleon trilogy. I'm sure they're just as good as this one. Last but not least, we come to Gladstone by Roy Jenkins. Now, I have a special story behind this book, which was given to me as a gift, actually. I did not pay for this with my own hard-earned money. This was gifted to me. And this was gifted to me by none other than Baroness Birmingham. It just so happens that many years ago, my mother, who is a nurse, was working in a hospital ward in intensive care, which is where she is based, and she was treating this man, this Lib Dem peer, called Lord Avesbury, who is now dead. He passed away some years ago. And during his time in hospital, he was visited by Baroness Birmingham, another Lib Dem peer. And I believe she came with her husband. I don't remember too well, but this is just me recounting as much as I can remember of what my mother told me. But my mother got talking to her, and in the process of that discussion, she let slip that her son, myself, wanted to become Prime Minister one day. And Baroness Birmingham was delighted to hear that. So the next time that she came to the ward where Lord Avesbury was recovering, she actually gave my mother a copy of Roy Jenkins' biography of Gladstone. And she put in it a postcard with a note saying the following. Let's see if I can read the writing here. Your son may like this excellent biography of one of our greatest prime ministers. What does it say after that? Should I, or something, or could I, no, that's not it. I shall live long enough to see your son as PM. Well, that's one ambition I've given up. But I'm finding it really hard to read this. But I bet he'll be a good one. So I think this, I doubt I shall live long enough to see your son as PM, but I bet he'll be a good one. With love and thanks for all of your care and friendship. So that is, well, I believe it was Baroness Birmingham, if I remember correctly. And that is her salutation to me. I've never met this woman, but I'm very grateful that she gave me this biography. And what a biography it is. It is something I read, again, many years ago. Haven't read in a long time. As you can tell by the crinkled pages, this spent an awful long time on my windowsill, the windowsill of my bedroom, being battered by the elements. Again, this is before my underlining days, so there are no passages I can read out to you that stuck out to me. But I remember enjoying this book immensely, although I also remember thinking what an immense prig and bigot Gladstone was, because he was, even by the standards of an out-and-out religious fundamentalist. A devout high church Anglican to his dying day, more or less. Although I think he mellowed somewhat as he became older. And this book goes into some detail about practically every aspect of his life. This is something that Roy Jenkins worked on very intensely. Jenkins, for those of you who don't know, was actually a leading member of the Labour Party during the 50s, 60s, and 70s. He actually left the party in the 1980s along with a small group of fellow Labour Party MPs who felt that the party had become too right-wing for them. Many people felt that he was never truly a socialist, and the fact that he later became a Lib Dem peer probably proves them right, and certainly the fact that his hero was the classical liberal Gladstone should be enough evidence for those who never saw him as a true socialist to hang their hat on. But this is probably the finest biography you could ever read. of a man who was undoubtedly one of our finest prime ministers. Some would say our greatest prime minister. So that is Gladstone by Roy Jenkins. And again, we come to the end of yet another non-fiction recommendations video. So like and subscribe if you appreciated all of the titles that I have presented to you for your delectation. And please feel free to give your opinions in the comment section, especially if you've read these books already. I'm very keen to hear what you thought of them. So signing off for now. Hope to speak to you again soon, BookTube.